Imagine starting a brand new horror game. Imagine the feeling in your gut turning those first few corners, hearing those first few sounds, experiencing those first few glimpses of danger. Now imagine finishing that same game. Imagine how these initial emotions have dulled, how you can now navigate areas and mechanics with little concern, how your capacity for fear has lowered. How would a graph of this process look? You might think it would look like this as a general correlation. The player gradually becomes more and more familiar with the game, and the fear of the unknown decreases over time. Even with surprises and more unknowns being introduced, just becoming familiar with the core mechanics and tone of the game leads to this decline. Except the decline doesn't look like this. It looks like this. This is because of something that all horror developers have to grapple with, something that I will try to explain through a combination of theory, examples, and even philosophy, something I like to call "Our nature exists in motion, complete rest is death." This quote by Blaise Pascal highlights the restlessness of the human condition, but for me it also highlights the complication of failure in horror games. What does a player want out of a horror game in terms of death? To start answering that question, I would turn to Pascal's work of philosophy, Pensée. To borrow an analogy from Alex O'Connor, imagine giving a bored gambler the maximum amount of money he could possibly win on the condition that he can no longer gamble. Would he be happy? No, likely not, so he wants to play the game. Now imagine taking away the prize, the possibility of winning any money at all, and then letting him play. Would he be happy then? No, likely not. So he wants the real possibility of winning the money, and the illusion that winning the money will make him happy, but he also can never win the money because that won't make him happy. This concept is normally applied to religion, but in this video I plan to flip it and apply it to horror games. And surprisingly, in a weird contradictory way, it fits perfectly. But before I dive into my theory, I should go over a few things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about immersion in horror games and why it's different to other genres. And then secondly, I'm going to apply that immersion to the context of a typical game cycle. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about the paradox itself. Then I'm going to give some potential solutions to it. And finally, my verdict and my advice to developers. Death in horror is very unique compared to other genres of games. Imagine, for example, dying in an action game where you might be reset a couple of minutes or so, compared to the complex systems of balancing, progress and saving, and the grisly animations of horror games. In action games, failure is something to be mostly avoided, but it doesn't matter if you die a couple of times because you get a quick game over screen and then you're back into it. Horror games are designed so that failure must be avoided at all costs. It impacts the player's progress, perhaps loading back many minutes to old save points. And usually includes some sort of drawn out animation or process before you can play again. The reason for this difference comes down to mainly one thing: immersion. And before I get into the real meat of my theory, I should establish a few things about it. In all media, immersion is about making the viewer forget what they're seeing isn't reality. In films, the only real way of accomplishing this is simply to have things make sense and avoid too many recognizable cliches. It works a little differently for horror games. Developers want the player themselves to actually be immersed in the danger, rather than being scared for the characters they're invested in, which is just an aspect of watching a general film. A horror player should actually be scared themselves, which is the core experience of playing one such game. And the developer's job of retaining immersion is not just more important, is also much more difficult. They have to be creative, because hiding the game making process from a player is much more difficult than hiding the filmmaking process from a viewer. They still want the player to forget the game is not reality, but in this scenario the player has complete autonomy over the main character's actions. Developers have to carefully construct danger and scares in a way that the player does what they need them to, but still feels like they have control. Some form of scripting is almost always necessary to make some proper good horror, but the key is to be able to hide it from the player and make everything look completely unpredictable. So immersion is paramount to horror games, and often involves the developer hiding or avoiding scripting and creating as much logical unpredictability as possible. Let's take a look at how this applies to the game cycle of a horror experience. The game cycle begins with a goal. This goal is either directly related to the threat of the game or is unrelated with the threat as an obstacle, if indeed there is a threat, which is the type of game I'm talking about. For now, let's focus on the second, where the goal and threat are unrelated in a gameplay sense. In attempting to reach their goal, what is the player's motivation for avoiding or destroying the threats in their way? Why are they scared? Is it A, because they are genuinely immersed and therefore scared of death? Or is it B, because they don't want to lose progress and it hinders their goal? Is either one of those better? Arguably A is. Any old game will have the player being scared of losing progress, whereas horror games tend to make the goals very simplistic, i.e. MacGuffins, to focus on A over B. However, both still apply. A will happen more towards the start of the game, and then eventually B will take precedent towards the end. This is because of the three distinct phases that a good survival horror game will typically undertake: the tutorial phase, the horror phase, and the game phase. The majority of the scripting will take place in the first two phases, option A, while the final phase will follow option B. I'll be using Amnesia the Bunker as a case study for this idea, so general spoiler warning for now. The tutorial phase isn't necessarily a normal tutorial, but it has the same function of teaching the player the basic mechanics of the game. It may be slightly scary, but it usually contains no real danger in any meaningful sense. It's mostly, in a way, a scripted sequence of events, something that the game won't be able to get away with later. In Amnesia the Bunker, for example, the monster cannot emerge before you get the red crank wheel on first playthrough, giving you a chance to get used to the non-monster related mechanics like resource management. The horror phase is where the danger slowly ramps up, perhaps along with fear. I believe that players normally, even subconsciously, have an idea of when this transition happens. In the horror phase, the real dangerous mechanics are fully on display, and the player is at the mercy of the threat. The scripted or standard behavior of the threat, along with the player's options for escaping or defending themselves, are mostly unknown. For example, in Amnesia the Bunker, the player may be aware that making noise is bad, but not the distinction between quiet noises, which incrementally increase the random chance of the creature emerging, and loud noises, which will almost certainly alert it to your location. But when the fresh fear fades as the player becomes familiar with these mechanics, and death becomes an ordinary occurrence, then what? Unlike in the horror phase, where the actual tasks a player has to do are simple to keep the focus on scares, in the game phase, the actual game difficulty ramps up, whether that be in the form of puzzles or combat or evasion. Here, the developer isn't so focused on horror because they're aware that the player's capacity for fear has likely somewhat lapsed. They'll still introduce new unknowns to keep the tension up, but gameplay takes center stage. In Amnesia the Bunker, the game stops giving you tiny amounts of resources and forcing you to traverse in the dark, and makes the fetch quests much longer and more detailed, forcing you to outmaneuver the monster with your knowledge of its behavior instead of constantly hiding and running. The developers are aware that keeping the same immersive, creepy tone and tasks will become tedious, and chooses to embrace the shift. Instead of fear being pure and immersive, it is now motivated more by a loss of progress, hence the transition from A to B. But this transition doesn't just begin when the player becomes familiar with the mechanics. As we've talked about already, death is a major catalyst for losing immersion. It is, for all intents and purposes, the very beginning of this transition. So, it's a bad thing? We've established that A is preferable to B. So why would a dev include the possibility of death at all? To answer that, we should probably talk about... Let's return to Pascal's Gambler and instead call him a horror game player. Imagine creating a game without the possibility for death or failure. Would that make him happy? No, horror game fans want danger and terror and death. Okay, now give them a game with a load of death. Would that make them happy? Well, no, because dying leaves them at complete rest for the first time, where their fear and immersion can potentially unravel. So players want the real possibility of death, and the illusion that death will be somehow terrifying or harmful to them, but they can never actually die because it won't actually be terrifying or harmful. In short, to feel the real possibility of death as much as possible while dying as little as possible. Once a player's character dies but doesn't stay dead, there is nothing the dev can do to uphold their fake reality. Non-fatal death is the ultimate immersion breaker. In reality, death is the end. In the game, it's not. That's impossible to reconcile. There's nothing else which has this inherently unrealistic nature. Even monsters and aliens are far more believable. So this is the dip in our graph, almost always taking place in the horror phase of a game. The first death, the first and most important break in immersion. But what if there was no death in the horror phase? Can a developer carefully craft a terrifying atmosphere with no real danger? How is the player supposed to know any differently? Yeah, spoiler alert, they will know. Imagine instead of a terrifying yet immersion-breaking early death, you play for hours without death. A scary atmosphere, creepy sounds, many close calls, yet no death. In this scenario, instead of transitioning from A to B, it transitions from A to nothing. And the graph looks like this. The entire game-making process is exposed through the idea that the dev is simply planting scares with no substance. After all, the only thing less believable than coming back from death is the idea that there is no death at all. So here we see the paradox and return to our Pascal's wager scenario. The less real danger a player is in, the more their immersion breaks. But the more real danger a player is in, the more likely they are to die and have their immersion broken. Despite the negative effect of that first death on immersion and fear, there has to be death at some point, or at least the possibility of it. So how does a dev balance the immersion of the player then, and walk this very thin line between the impossibility of surviving death and the improbability of surviving this supposedly terrifying, danger-filled world? I got a mic. I don't know if this works very well, but option 1, make your game short. Short games often don't have this problem, at least the ones which steer the player away from death. In Iron Lung and The Mortuary Assistant, two great horror games, there actually isn't a way for the player to die mid-playthrough, but the short runtime means that this doesn't become an issue. The scripted events that happen throughout might not be real, but the player hasn't played enough to get used to this idea. However, when we're talking about longer survival horror games, this obviously is not an option. So option 2, alternative fail states. Many games look for more out-of-the-box options. Unfortunately, I couldn't find many examples of alternative fail states in horror. There is the obvious Until Dawn route, but that only works in such a narrative or story-focused game. In Planescape Torment, the character is canonically immortal, so you'll wake up in a mortuary every time you die. And this logic of finding a canon reason for death also applies to games like Death Stranding, Bioshock Infinite, Outer Wilds, etc. Honestly, I'm surprised that more games, especially horror games, don't do this more. Of course, trying to implement an alternative to the classic game over screen might come off as quite janky or gimmicky. The third option is much more common. Option 3, balance. And now the one that most horror games strive for, simply balance and well-hidden scripting. I should clarify here, I'm not actually overly educated on survival horror games. I haven't played that many. Most of my knowledge comes from watching Jacksepticeye YouTube playthroughs, so thank you, Sean. I'm going to try and find some good examples of games for the next section, but honestly, from here on out, it's mostly theory more than anything else. So that being said, here is my official, completely unprofessional advice to devs. First, as a general rule, don't force the player to die to learn the enemy mechanics. Either in the tutorial phase or throughout the whole game, there should be features which implicitly teach the player how to survive. I don't mean a real tutorial. For me, those are often too immersion breaking for a horror game, though I understand the trade-off for grasping mechanics quickly. If you need to write out certain things in words, make it logical or even pivotal to the game's lore. Throughout the game's opening, allow them to learn what certain sounds, visuals, movements, and behaviors mean in the environment, and how the player should respond to them. In short, get creative and design your threats with this in mind. Number 2, diversify the horror in the horror phase. Make the time before the player has their first death count as much as possible. It's obviously never certain when the first death will happen, but there's usually a window that the average player falls into. Before that happens, make some creepy environments, sound cues, eerie lore reveals. I don't endorse scripting too many scares, but if you can naturally integrate a few good ones, then do it, as long as you don't show your hand too early. And also spread out the introduction of different unknowns. For example, the appearance of certain enemies to keep the tension up in this section. Number 3, diversify your gameplay in the game phase. Don't keep those exact same simple mechanics once the novelty of your horror has worn off. Resource management is often an excellent natural way to do this, and introducing more items, limited inventory space, potentially a crafting system, can add an interesting element of strategy to your experience. Up the difficulty, up the enemy aggression, have longer periods between safe sections, etc, etc. This all obviously depends on what type of game you're making. But what I'm saying is accept the transition. Number 4, do not accept the transition. And I'm only partly kidding about that. You should allow the gameplay to take precedence towards the end, but don't remove the horror from your horror game. Still introduce some more unknowns, as long as you're not constantly hammering the player with new enemies out of left field which completely change the game they're playing. For example, the shotgun sequence in Amnesia the Bunker was a real breath of fresh air. providing me with a new sense of horror that I thought had faded in that game. If you haven't noticed, I believe that the bunker is a masterclass in navigating, balancing, and scripting in horror, so it's going to be brought up 1 or 2 more times. For my final point, I'll briefly mention some cool unique save systems which might serve to make your game phase more interesting. Shock horror, the bunker has a great feature on shell shock modes, where saving requires being able to make it back to your safe room, and also fuel, a resource which is otherwise extremely useful. The limited save system, or ink ribbons, in Resident Evil 1 is just one of the many groundbreaking features of this genre-defining game. It's the system at its most simple but done very well. For an especially unique one, in Fear and Hunger, the player is forced into a coin flip when trying to save. It's a small detail, but it adds extra tension to the game phase. These are just about the only save systems I could come up with, but please feel free to comment if you can think of any more. So, there we go. That is my advice to developers on navigating the death paradox and the 3 phases of a horror game. It might be very obvious that I'm coming at this from an extremely specific angle, and I'm sure this advice does not apply to plenty of games out there. But I hope no matter the length, style, or tone of your game, that some of the advice will provoke thought. Now, there's only one thing left to do. Death is inevitable in horror. If everything else, all the scary and creepy features, is smoke, then death is fire. And of course, smoke without fire is just fog. Creepy at first, but ultimately harmless. And if you do end up in the fire and come out completely uninjured, then it's not going to be so scary the second time round. So take advantage of the time when the fog really does seem scary, and know when to turn the fire from smoldering to raging. You can't just force the player to stumble through fire and smoke the same way you force them to stumble through fog. You need to give them means to avoid it all. And if they get burned, they get burned. In hindsight, maybe my terminology hasn't been perfect in this video. The way that we can immerse ourselves in false realities and make part of us believe that dying in a horror game has real consequences, and how quickly we can stop believing that, isn't a paradox. It's just part of modern human nature. Like Pascal said, we are restless, and our minds adapt very quickly. For a dev to force a player to remain in the same state throughout a whole game is almost impossible. But the first death doesn't signal the decline of the game's capacity to scare you. It signals the decline of the game's capacity to scare you in a certain way. But there's always more, as long as you keep an open mind. Thank you very much for watching. As you can probably tell, this video took quite a while to make, from the outfit change and the new equipment. Hopefully it works well. Feel free to comment if you have any thoughts, if you disagree, agree. I think this is a good video, and I hope people have opinions on that and opinions on what I said. So again, thank you very much, and see you around.